Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the lunchtime lectures. For those of you who don't know the format, I think most people here do, but we have to finish slightly before 1:30 because of classes this afternoon. But apart from that, we are ready to go. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael North. I should say welcome him back because he's lectured here on several occasions over the last 10 years or so. He is Professor and Chair of Modern History and Director of the Graduate Programme of a project on the Baltic borderlands at the Ernst, Moritz and University of Greifswald. And this winter he's just finished a stint as a visiting professor at Santa Barbara in the Modern History department. Professor North is really a historian, one of the outstanding historians of art and art markets, art and commerce, consumption and taste in the early modern period. He's written on art and commerce in the Dutch Golden Age, a book of 1997, followed by a book on cultural consumption in the German Enlightenment in 2008. He's also written economic histories, I would say, of the Baltic, most recently in 2014 by Harvard University Press. And most recently he's branched out to consider the cross-cultural relations between Europe and Asia, particularly in two edited volumes, Art and Cultural Exchanges between Europe and Asia, 1400 and 1900, and more recently, Mediating Netherlandish Art and Material Culture in Asia, which he co-edited with Thomas de Costa Kaufmann. So it's a great pleasure, and I know there's a lot of people here particularly interested in Batavia and Europe, and so welcome, Michael.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be back at this nice place, and I have followed more or less the development of the BGC for the last 15 years, because the first visit of mine was here in 2000, and then I lectured, I think, in 2001. So it's a long history, and I could only congratulate you, and I would love German universities developing like this. At least we are trying, and we are making some progress. So I will lead you to 17th, 18th century Batavia, but I will start with a kind of introduction first. After John Moritz had been named stadtholder of Brazil by the West India Company, he took painters such as Franz Post and Albert Eckhout with him on his Brazilian travels. And those painters were recording the everyday life of Brazil. Post mainly landscapes, while Eckhout was painting people. They thus made an important contribution to the European knowledge of Brazil. Historians, art historians, ethnologists have praised the authenticity of the portraits and at the same time underlined their role as kind of colonial representation. Although Dutch power eroded in Brazil and John Moritz returned to Holland, the 100 paintings, colonial paintings, still coins the visual image of Brazil. They were commissioned by John Moritz, but they can also be regarded or interpreted as a representation, since the patron, collector and the founder of the so-called Moritz donated the major part of his paintings to European princes, such as Frederick of Denmark, the great elector of Brandenburg, and especially Louis XIV of France. And that is why we find the majority of these paintings now in France or in Denmark. In France they provided the model for tapestries as well. Compared with these series produced over the course of 10 years, the visual documents of the Dutch presence in Asia have been found less interest, although the Dutch East India Company has long attracted historians. Most publications were on trade, on shipping, institutional organization of the Dutch East India Company. To fill this lacuna, a group of scholars from the US, Asia, and especially the Netherlands have organized a research group in 2010 at the Netherlandish Institute for Advanced Study. The book came out, Andrew mentioned this, Mediating Netherlandish Art, and we were trying to research the long Dutch visual and cultural impact on Asian cultures. And I will try to give some ideas about this in my paper today. To give you an impression, these are the trade routes, and it's of course the different settlements of the VOC, and I won't go into detail, and I will concentrate myself on Batavia, nowadays Jakarta. To create legitimacy, the Dutch East India Company commissioned portraits of the Governor-General. This was the first issue. These portraits form a kind of artistic testimony of the Dutch presence in Asia, a special corpus of paintings that for a long time dominated our view on Dutch colonial painting. This gallery of portraits should demonstrate Dutch dominion. However, it was influenced by European princely portraits, and furthermore, it was influenced by the gallery of viceroys in Goa, the Portuguese settlement, and the first Dutch who went further east were of course stopping over at Goa and then saw this still existing amazing gallery, and then they had, it was clear that they would need something on their own. They had no viceroys, but they had governor-generals. So it became a practice for the governor-general, at least at the end of his period, to commission a portrait of himself, and the majority of those portraits at the beginning were painted in Asia, not probably by Dutch painters. Later on, it became fashionable to commission portraits in the Netherlands, especially in the 18th century. And Philip van Dyck was one of the famous portrait painters in the Netherlands, and Baron van Imhoff was commissioning a couple of paintings, and some of those paintings were taken to Batavia and exhibited there in the great hall, and I will show you a picture of this great hall later on. Even at the end of the 18th century, it was fashionable to have famous European painters such as Friedrich August Tischbein to paint portraits, and the governors generals are more or less setting themselves like European princes. Those were the declining years of the VOC, and it was Alting portrait as a representative of the Ancien regime in an elegant French style. When the Dutch colonial rule ended in 1949, that was happening to the gallery. A famous photograph by the famous Henri Cartier-Bresson shows the dismantling, the removal of the governor portraits in Jakarta. Perhaps it was good then, because nowadays you could witness the gallery again in Amsterdam. Those portraits had great influence on indigenous paintings. For example, paintings of indigenous rulers. such as Saifuddin, Sultan of Tidore, who was an ally of the Dutch in the 17th century. Probably in the context of the alliance with the Dutch, Saifuddin's portrait was painted in Batavia or in the area, handed over in exchange for a portrait of his ally, the Dutch Governor-General. And interestingly, and this is an interesting story of collecting as well, the portrait made its way to Holland via the Amsterdam art market. And on the Dutch art market, it was sold, auctioned, and who bought it? The Polish family of Czartoryski, the foreign minister of 18th century Poland, who built up a famous gallery close to Warsaw. And this gallery was designed into different parts, and it had a part gallery, a sub-gallery of freedom fighters. And in this freedom fighter gallery, Saifuddin was hanged again together with Wilhelm Tell, Joan of Arc, George Washington, and Tipu Sultan. So we had a quite amazing story, and it's interesting for students as well. The meaning of the portrait changed in different regimes of value. It was a portrait of an ally, it was an object on the Amsterdam art market, and later, and in between it was a gift as well, and later on it became a monument in a gallery, and it's still there in the Czartoryski Gallery, nowadays housed in Krakow in Poland. We are coming now to the visual evidence of collecting in Batavia. And here you see the gallery of those governors, and you see decorative elements, paintings on the wall in the assembly hall of the Council of the Indies in Batavia. They were assembling under a big parasol, a big umbrella, and they were decorating their room not only with those portraits, other Dutch oil paintings, but at the same time with this Chinese teak screen, which everyone would see who enters the room by this door. So we have cross-cultural elements, even or especially in the gathering room as a big hall in Batavia. Another print shows the living rooms of the governor of Batavia. In this case, Adrian Falkenier of the 1744. Then you see again, some of the portrait paintings were in the living room, but you have a lavish decoration. Of course, that should be one of the Princes of Orange. Yes, a prominent gift of the Princess of Orange. And then you have the variety of chairs and small tables, so-called gueridons, which were prominent in Batavian households and will come back in the inventories. The surviving pictures were mainly produced in Batavia. Some were like this family portrait. Some were produced in the Netherlands. The Riebeck daughters were not in the Netherlands. They were the daughters of the founder of the Cape colony, and so they must have been portrayed either on the Cape, the landscape would speak at least for this, or in Batavia. Interestingly, these paintings, the next two paintings depicting Batavia by Beekman and depicting the Dutch factory in Hooghly in India, were painted in the Netherlands, and they were painted to decorate the assembly room in the Dutch East India House in Amsterdam. One of the major sources for our research are, however, inventories. Inventories of colonial households, so-called probate inventories, that register the mobile goods left behind by a deceased person. And you have in your Warwick inventory, where you edited this nice book, and the inventory as well, a very good example. And there are hundreds and thousands of inventories still available in the Netherlands, and especially in Batavia. However, unlike the Warwick inventory and unlike Dutch inventories, often colonial inventories from Batavia don't specify the subject of a painting or a painter in the manner which we would love to have it as historians, art historians. Nevertheless, we have a couple of art collections by employees of the Dutch East India Company in Batavia and elsewhere mentioned in inventories. For example, the governor of Taiwan, François Caron, was handing over office in 1644 together with 22 Dutch paintings, portraits of the houses of Orange, which we already saw, religious histories, seascapes, and this was a collection which was given and passed over, which was enriched and augmented over the last or the next couple of years. But apart from those official members of the VOC, it's interesting to have a look into inventories of private persons. And one of the few early inventories, still very good, very well readable, is an inventory by Gillis Winant, a merchant and citizen of Batavia from 1627, who had established an impressive collection of paintings which were auctioned together with his estate in 1627. And the paintings are specified with respect to size, with respect to frame, with respect to subject, with respect to provenance. And so you have mostly landscapes, but you have small and bigger Dutch and Chinese paintings. However, you have other objects of art as well. For example, porcelain figures, and especially those prints of the 12 Sibyls. You have alabaster goddesses and so on. Sometimes we have to speculate what was behind those notions. However, with the Sibyls it could be quite easy, because Crispin de Passe made a series of 12 Sibyls which were very popular in the Netherlands and probably popular in Batavia as well. What is behind the Chinese paintings, and I have presented a kind of lecture to Chinese colleagues a couple of times, and they got at least some ideas which could be behind those paintings. Hanging scrolls, for example, or more probable, sometimes mentioned as Chinese prints, woodcuts. silk ink paintings were popular as well. And of course, woodcut prints, reproducing paintings. These are probably the Chinese images mentioned in inventories, and if you have other suggestions, please let me know. However, it was of course those porcelain and sometimes alabaster statuettes. Quite important is the Bodhisattva, Ganyin, which you could interpret as Mary as well, so very popular, produced for export in China. And here you have a nice image as well, or nice statuettes as well. You know those from Chinese restaurants, of course. And but that's really first-hand evidence, because those lions which appear in inventories were on board of the VOC ship Osterland that sank off Batavia, not of Batavia, it came from Batavia, but it sank off Cape Town, and it was excavations going on, and numerous kinds of those statuettes were on board. Chinese paintings, if they would have been on board, were of course deteriorated, but at least the lions and numerous other porcelain figures to be shipped to Cape Town and to the Netherlands survived. We have, of course, visual evidence again, but not so much. One of the famous painters, drawers, draftsmen who lived in Batavia was a German minister, Jan Brandes, who interestingly studied at my home university of Greifswald, and then made his way as a minister to the Indies, and he recorded Ceylon, Batavia, Cape Town, of course his ship travel as well. And this scene, the tea visit, is quite remarkable. Many historians have spoken about it, but normally not recorded the decorative elements in this scene. And this represents what we find in the inventories as well. So it's a kind mixture of people. We have the multi-ethnic society of Batavia. We have Eurasian ladies married to Dutch employees or to Dutch merchants, like this lady. We have, of course, ladies visiting for tea. Then we have a couple of slaves who are serving. This lady shows the kebaya, the typical dress for the Indies. The slaves would show the sarongs. And if you go to the decorative elements, you could start with the sashed windows, a British invention more or less, very fashionable in 18th century Britain. Then just going along the wall. Here you have a Chinese painting. One of those Chinese paintings mentioned in the inventories. Then you would have those nice gilded tables with a marble element. We saw those at the governor's flat apartment as well. Then we have those lavish decorated mirrors imported from Europe. Then we would have Chinese porcelain, we would have Tonkin, the water pots from Tonkin, nowadays Vietnam. Then we would have copper spittoons, very important, because this is beetle nuts. And I remember Mrs. Warwick had those beetle boxes as well. It was a habit of not only the Eurasian ladies, but the ladies in Batavia as well. And you were showing beetle, and then you had to spit there, even though it was probably not very nice to have this black gravy in your mouth. So that's a habit, and so it's very, very typical. And last but not least, we have, of course, tea, porcelain, and those important guéridons which is one of the dernier cri fashions in Europe at the same time, to serve your tea tablet, for example. So tea tray is better. So this is visual evidence, and we could conclude for this first part that more or less all the subjects known in the Dutch Republic in households as regards paintings and additional Chinese paintings, Chinese porcelain was present in the households of the Dutch burghers and of the perhaps middle class families as well. Over time, we notice a rising number of paintings even in modest households in Batavia. For example, the burgher Nicolas Cesbier left behind 7 small paintings, 34 big paintings. Some of them were paintings on glass, and even modest households were mentioning 22 inexpensive paintings and portraits. Dutchmen, who often cohabitated with their Eurasian wives or concubines, created a kind of Asian Dutchness in their households by merging European and Asian lifestyles and displaying a cross-cultural selection of artifacts in their home. And this drawing or watercolor is quite a good testimony of it. I'm coming now to the households of the Chinese and the Muslim population. And I have to remind you that the Dutch in Batavia were a minority. They were outnumbered by the Chinese, and they were of course totally outnumbered by the slave population. It was about 7,000 to 8,000 Dutchmen, and it was perhaps 10,000 Chinese, and it would be 50,000 slaves in Batavia, and then it would be, of course, the Malay Muslim population. So, if we go through the, we were lucky to get some of the inventories from the 18th century out about the Chinese and the Muslim population, and if we go through those, it would appear that the majority of Chinese households did not display paintings. One reason may very well have been the comparatively modest means of the deceased Chinese persons and their households, which leads us to assume that the process of embellishing and decorating was a little bit behind. On the other hand, we have evidence that the decoration of Chinese homes followed different patterns. Among the first objects acquired by a Chinese for his households were bird cages, then lanterns, copper lamps, mirrors, and clocks. Only after these objects, or demand for these objects was satisfied, then Chinese households proceeded to acquire decorative paintings and prints. However, it was mainly modest paintings, cheap prints, if you go through the numbers. And this table would more or less confirm this. This small painting is nearly nothing worth, while the Chinese cage and the pendulum clock would of course be of considerable value. Sometimes we have no evidence about the prices, but here we have a gilded cage, 3 paintings, 7 Chinese paintings, and so on. Here we have again a Frisian clock, and I will show you one in a minute. Oval mirror, so a bit more important. Chinese paintings on glass, paintings in golden frames, then bunches of paintings, small mirrors. So mirrors feature very prominently in those households. Then again the table clock and mirrors, hanging lamp. So paintings were there, but in the smaller households they had no priority. And we go further down with small mirrors, one Chinese painting, 4 paintings on clocks, Frisian clock, and you see the mirrors and the clock are having prominence, but in 1804 Tianchenko had quite a collection, 9 paintings, 24 paintings, 23 paintings, 2 mirrors and a clock. This is one of those Chinese paintings on glass, Chinese export paintings, which we find in European and in Chinese households in Batavia. And more or less of similar interest are the inventories of the Muslim or non-Chinese inhabitants. Although Muslim men and women tended to splurge on personal effects, we have lavish jewelry, for example, lavish clothing, they increasingly also came to decorate their households with fashionable East Asian and Western objects. And so we have, of course, the clocks again, but the Chinese cages as well as the Frisian clock in the Free Makassar Abdul Yalik, and here with the Balinese captain. A captain is an official person who is a representative of the Balinese in the area. You have a Chinese cage, you have candlesticks, copper lantern, mirrors, and rich clothing, but modest jewelry. And we could go further on. For example, quite amazing is this one small round Dutch table, so you have Dutch furniture as well. And interestingly, it's a notion. It's really mentioned. It's not a Chinese table. There were Chinese tables, there were sometimes Chinese chairs, but the kleine ronde Nederlandse tafel is mentioned. One big painting must probably be a Netherlandish painting, then mirrors, candlesticks, but English copper, lanterns, and expensive jewelry as well. So quite amazing. Similar rich here. The free Balinese Frau, the lady Asam. And this is the Frisian clock, which is one of the prominent objects in Chinese and in Muslim households. Not so much in Dutch households. It's produced in Friesland and it's nicely decorated, and so people liked it. It was not so expensive, while the Chinese and, for example, people from Bali and Java, Malay people liked it. The Dutch had a taste for English pendulum clocks, so they would not hang a Frisian clock in their households, but at least there was a market for a Frisian clock in the area. Estate auctions played a significant role in facilitating the interaction of the different ethnic groups and their respective material cultural markets. Although the few existing auction protocols lead us to assume that it was in the 17th century above all the Dutch burghers who were purchasing furniture and Asian and Dutch objects, paintings from their fellow citizens. In the 18th century, auctions had clearly become a touch point for all ethnic groups. The curious example arises from an auction protocol which I found lately of the late bankrupt Armenian merchant Kosoro Petrus. There was, of course, not only the Dutch trading network, there was a Chinese trading network, and it was, of course, the Armenian trading network as well. He had, in addition to a large stock of Madeira wine, a rich household with Dutch, Chinese and Muslim bidders, and one Chinese named Simtimku appears to have had an eye for decorative objects. First of all, he purchased a large painting in grote schilderijen for the price of 17 Reichsdaler, and the price and the size led us to suppose that it was a large Dutch painting that found its way from an Armenian household into a Chinese household, perhaps even further if Samtimko acted as an agent for another client. He also acquired 3 hanging lamps, 4 copper spittoons, quite expensive, beds, chairs, gerinos, this mentioned tables, gambling tables, for a total of 94 Reichsdaler. Apart from several bottles of wine, another Piero Muhammad, who could be a Christian Mardiker, might be a Muslim as well, was purchasing expensive copper lanterns, a table clock in glass, and so on. So everyone was bidding. Unfortunately, we don't not enough about other successful bidders. They only appear in the auction protocols. At least we can assume that many try to obtain some decorative objects for their homes. Whether family connections played a role is not always evident. I'm coming to a short conclusion. In my paper, I have tried to trace collecting across cultures in 17th and 18th century Batavia. When people moved to Batavia from Europe or East Asia or from Cape Town, they brought with them only a small part of decorative objects, probably for commemorative purposes. If they wanted more art, they had to commission paintings, or they had to collect from the stock which was available, or they had make recourse to an auction where you could easily acquire paintings. Estate auctions, as we heard, played an important role. And according to those different media of purchase, exchange assumed many forms and directions. On the one hand, Dutch collecting patterns, Dutch decorative patterns, disseminated via the Dutch East India Company, the upper social strata, to the middle strata, and the different indigenous groups. On the other hand, Chinese styles were received by Europeans in Batavia very early on, who bought and displayed Chinese, sometimes Japanese cultural goods of many kinds, those Chinese paintings, as the statues are only one example. Different identities emerged, although today we still know very little about the motives and the role that material objects played in constructing or reinforcing these identities. More evidence and research is required. Of course, the role of models in the display, for example, and of course the global circulation of those objects. And with your Varik inventory and your publication, you made a very good step in this direction. And I told Andrew already, I'm now working, or I'm starting to work on Dutch inventories in Suriname, and now would like to get the West India inventories into this global picture of decorative art. Many thanks.
The floor is now open for questions.
Thank you very much, that was fascinating. So I noticed in the inventories that you reproduced here, you didn't have a lot of textiles listed, and one of the main types of objects that we found were many different kinds of textiles.
I could have given a lecture on textiles as well, and I will send you a paper which I gave on Dutch sarongs and kebayas in inventories, for example. So in this project, I was only focusing on more or less material culture, images and art objects. I could have given a paper on furniture and so on as well, but you know how rich those inventories are, and since this project was emerging in this context of this research group on the cultural impact of Netherlandish art and material culture to Asia, on Asia, it was, we were concentrating, and I got the task, yes, to do, and I did Cape Town and Batavia, and was looking on material culture and paintings. So they are so rich, and I would have loved to give a paper on slaves, because those inventories, as you know, mention the slaves from all over the Indian Ocean, which were, yes, brought to Cape Town, and then, for example, Cape Town or Batavia, and then you have Anna of Bengalen as a slave in Cape Town, marrying herself up, decorating her home with Dutch paintings, for example. So it's a lot of stories which you could tell, but the times I found it limited.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. This is a question about the painting specifically. Yeah. Fascinating. In the Tea Party picture, the images on the wall, they were square. They were not like a Chinese scroll. They were maybe the dimensions of a woodblock. I wondered if they were definitive enough to guess, and related to that is the question, the woodblock image you showed was very familiar. I know these from books. It's Let's Go Through the 12 Seasons and See the Happy Farmers. So I'm wondering, were they printed as individual leaves for art distribution, or were the sellers tearing up the books, as so often happens now, and selling the leaves as art? Or do you
that's the last question I could not answer, but interestingly, you have both. You have individual leaves, but you have albums as well. And so some famous people from the Dutch East India Company were bequeathing albums with drawings, Muslim drawings, Chinese drawings, Dutch drawings, for example. So it both happened. But if you have it on the wall, then of course it was individual leaves.
But could the original source have been one of these bound books?
That could be, but this is not mentioned. And interestingly, the evidence is of course only in Dutch sources, and then if some Dutchman is recording it and sending it to friends, and then probably the album is made in Batavia with those individual leaves, I would say. As regards the painting or the print, it's probably not a scroll. Sometimes I have evidence that it's about a hanging scroll, but this must be one of the cheaper Dutch, Chinese either watercolors or prints, and I found a picture of an Indian workshop, or a workshop that was trading Asian goods from 18th century India, and there I found a similar Chinese painting as well. So they must be very common.
This is a very interesting lecture. I was wondering, first of all, it is a kind of a crossover thing, but the tea set in the painting would also have been probably Chinese porcelain at this time, correct? And but maybe you excluded that from your list because it wasn't decorative. But the second thing is, what kind of examples of Japanese products did you run into? Because after all, the Dutch were the only people with access.
I could. Another paper would, of course, be on the commodities, because most of those people had a big commodity stock as well. Spices, textiles, tea, and so on. but Japanese objects play an important role as well. They are not so much visible in the visual evidence, but Japanese lacquerware and Japanese boxes is always mentioned. And this Gilles Venant had at least 3 or 4 Japanese lacquer boxes in his household.
Okay, and so I noticed that you have bunches of paintings and individual paintings.
Yeah.
What determined whether it was a single painting or a bunch?
Yes, the bunch is sort, in sort. 5 Schildereien in sort would be a bunch of paintings, and a single painting would be een schilderij or een schilderijtjes.
So it's like a job lost.
Yeah.
Does that mean framed? I'm sorry, I don't
Yeah,
know.
no,
Does that mean that an individual painting would have been framed versus something that was unframed in a group, or?
Normally, if the paintings are framed, it's mentioned because the frame constituted a kind of value.
First of all, abject admiration for what you've done. I remember when Deborah and I did the Van Varak, we despaired at being able to identify more precisely some of these types, and we hoped by doing the project that somebody else would be inspired to come along. So it's wonderful what you've done. I had just a question, a different sort of question. When you mentioned the different places in the Dutch colonial maritime world that you are now looking at, the inventories, do you have any sense yet whether there are different complexions to the material culture in places like Cape Town or Batavia or Suriname?
Yeah. I have some evidence because I did Cape Town and I did Batavia and Malacca as well. And so Malacca, for example, and Batavia are very, very close. But the presence of the English, for example, in the inventories of Malacca was already in the 18th century, when the English were not formally yet there and it was still Dutch, was quite amazing. So English material culture played a role, and this is similar, interestingly, in Cape Town already in the late 18th century. Furthermore, you have, of course, in Cape Town different kinds of European immigrants. So you have a lot of German soldiers getting there and staying there. You have the French Huguenots there. So the Cape Town inventories are a little bit more European in this respect. Nevertheless, what you don't have what you have in Cape Town is this category of free blacks. So people who had been slaves in the Indian Ocean came to Cape Town, were released and were setting up households, for example, or marrying up. And this is a special social category in Cape Town which would not appear in Batavia, for example. And they have a different, a mixed Asian and mixed European households, because they were often marrying European people. So they were different, but you would not, unlike, of course, Cape Town was a colony and it was more or less limited to Cape Town and Stellenbosch and the area. You would, of course, not have a big Chinese community. You would not have a big Asian dominating community in Cape Town, for example. In Suriname, we have only a little evidence. In Suriname, we have a big Jewish community, which is quite amazing, after they left Brazil. And you have Frenchmen, you have Swiss guys, you have Portuguese and Dutch. So it's a different Caribbean-European mixture. And We have been looking for free burghers, former slaves, but not yet successfully, but we have 3,000 pages to go through in the next couple of years. And hopefully there will be something.
Just one little follow-up, which
Yeah.
is in the Batavian and I guess Malaccan,
Yeah.
there are lots of East Asian goods that
Yeah.
wind up in these inventories. In Cape Town and Suriname, are there also African and South American goods?
But yes, there are, but especially there are East Asian goods in Cape Town to a large extent, and even in Suriname as well. And this is one of our concerns as well, that we are looking for to try the global follow-up, to try to look to East Asian goods in Suriname. And there are, of course, South American goods, yes, yeah. They're commodities more or less.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. I was wondering, like you mentioned the commission, like when they immigrated from
Yeah.
East Asia, they brought only a limited number of decorative arts. And
Yeah.
later, when they need more, they were commissioned.
Yeah.
And who were the producers of those works? And were they from European artists, or they were from transported from East Asia through the Dutch
Yeah.
East Indian Company?
This is a very good question. There was artisans and painters and even European Dutch painters on the spot in Batavia. So we know that there's a lot of migration of European painters according to the Dutch sources to Batavia. They were not migrating as painters. Some were migrating as painters. Others were migrating in the service of the Dutch East India Company. And after 3 years term, then settling there. And so in our project, Martin Jan Bock from Amsterdam has at least traced 60, 70 painters whom we know had been mentioned in the sources of Batavia. But normally you can't, some are prominent of course, but most of them are there, but you can't contribute works of art to them, which is always the big problem. But there was an artistic production on the spot, and interestingly, not in Batavia, but in Cape Town, I found a couple of painters, and I found painters who were fortunately dying and were leaving a stock of unfinished paintings, which we know from the Netherlands as well, on their attic, for example. And then we know what are the commissions, and what is even more interesting, and there are libraries, and there's this great Schilder book, this book on paintings by Gérard Lerès, famous Dutch author on art. And one of those copies I found in a household in Cape Town. But that is all, of course, I was lucky to find it, but that normally people would not record it. And very much depends on the people recording the leftovers, the estate, and how into detail they are going. And sometimes in the library, they go by title and author, and then you are happy.
I had a question. I love the comparison between the inventories from the different communities, and I just wondered to what extent do they, can one tell if they reflect social differences or distinctions between within the social structure? In other words, there's an old town and there's a new town in Batavia. The Dutch, I think, were quite isolated from the other, as I understand, from the other sections of the community. So can one see through the inventories these social distinctions, and are they reflected in the material culture that you've observed?
You can, but on the other hand, the Dutch were not so isolated because they had the area Eurasian wives and concubines. And
sure.
So they are not so isolated. But socially, of course, you could, if you go through an inventory of one of the GovernorGeneral and compare it with one of the normal artisans or small merchants, then you would have social differences and a difference in artistic display. And at the beginning, it was the lower classes would not consume and hang as much art as the upper classes, but probably you would get the idea that they loved paintings as well, but they would go for the cheaper version of the painting. So, those inventories which I mentioned for the 1780s of Dutch modest households, so it was an awful lot of paintings, but it was always cheap paintings and prints, while, for example, this Gilles Venant had more expensive paintings, for example, and bigger paintings, better framed paintings, and so on.
And my other question was, it was quite a mobile population, I think, of the Dutch. They came, they stayed for a few years, but then would go away again.
If they not died, that's on the spot.
Yeah, often leaving their Eurasian wives behind, as I gather. So, is there any application? Does that have any sort of?
Yes, of course. No, and if you are a successful Eurasian wife, you could marry up a couple of times and marry yourself up as well, or find a new lover. And there's of course nice stories about this as well. Interestingly, the kids could be acknowledged. Unlike in British India, for example, a Dutch father could acknowledge his kid with an indigenous concubine or wife, and then the kid would get full rights, inheritance rights, for example. Sometimes those kids were sent to the Netherlands for education.
Thanks, Professor Morse. I'm really interested in your topic because I'm dealing with a similar case, but in the ancient Asian. So they have the multi-ethnic group people exist together in the same social space. So I noticed that you deliver your talk from the perspective of the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Muslims. But you also mentioned that there's intermarriage, at least between the Dutch and Chinese, and the Asian concubines. So I don't know how, because we already see the interaction between the different ethnic groups. I don't know how would you define what is a Dutch, what is a Chinese, when they already so heavily.
I can make it quite simple. I have to live more or less with the notions of the sources. If a table is called Dutch, it's a Dutch table because someone in Batavia in the 17th century was recording it as Dutch. Or if the notion is Chinese, someone was recording it as Chinese. But they must have been a feeling for it. It would be great, and I have encouraged this, but not with success so far, to go into the Chinese archives in Batavia. And the Chinese had an administration in Batavia and so on. And I've asked people, could you please tell me, are there Chinese inventories, are they different? But no one has taken this up so far. There should be some sources, and I've given a kind of lecture in Beijing and in Taiwan and Asian Studies conferences, and always the Chinese scholars or the people doing Chinese art history are coming and are telling me that there is of course a great tradition in art production, art markets. All those institutions existed more or less in China as well. And of course people had art in their households, but we have some images which we can compare. I did not show them this time. But it's still a big question to link the research which I'm doing together with the research on the Chinese, is the Chinese diaspora, for example. Where we are doing this, or where we are starting to do this, is textiles, interestingly. There is this famous colleague, Peter Lee in Singapore, who wrote a big book on sarong kebaya, for example, and he uses Chinese Peranakan evidence as well as Dutch evidence of inventories. So, but then it's more or less in Southeast Asia, and we should bring more Chinese sources from Southeast Asia into the picture, which is not easy.
I made the goods, you opened the window to how stuff came in.
Yeah.
Did the Chinese goods come direct from China or through Taiwan?
They came directly. They came mostly from Canton.
Okay.
Yeah, it was interestingly this junk trade, and the Chinese would not go to Canton very often, but it was Chinese junks from Canton that regularly served Batavia.
And was there any shift in that between the Ming and the Qing?
It was a shift in the Qing period, of course. Later on, especially when the English went directly to Canton and the other Europeans went to Canton, then Batavia was a bit outplayed because for a long time the VOC insisted that every Chinese trade has to go via Batavia, and since they did not go, and the Chinese did go, of course, but only in the late 18th century the Dutch realized it would be good to send ships directly from Amsterdam to Canton instead of going to Batavia, and so the Dutch were lagging behind in the China trade, for example, compared to the English.
I had one question about I was fascinated by the Chinese screen, I think, in the council.
Yeah.
And again, is that something you think would have been, that's evidence certainly of imported Chinese furnishings?
Yeah.
Presumably.
Yeah.
Or I mean, I suppose the other question that these inventories might invoke is there a kind of Batavian local indigenous style of furniture making and the material culture?
No, it is definitely, and it's Chinese production. So Chinese artisans are working on Chinese beds, and I don't have it. I don't have it. No. There's something else. Collecting Asian and European art in India by Sophony, and no, that's the last one, unfortunately. In another presentation, I have a so-called Chinese chair, what the Dutch call the Chinese chair, and of course it's a red chair with gilded decoration, and this was produced by Chinese chair makers or furniture makers, but nevertheless there is of course a lot of artistic Batavia production, special chairs, the so-called Bürgermeister chair, or you have a kind of Daniel Marot chair in Batavia after European prints and so on. And furniture making is mostly done not by Dutch but by people from the Malay archipelago. Yeah. And so you could of course take those examples. You have an awful lot of chairs in the inventories. Normally you only could decipher them if they have an attribution like Chinese chair or English chairs or English furniture, even though produced locally, is of course labeled English chairs and English furniture.
But there's no term for Batavia.
No, there's no term for Batavia, and you don't have people who were producing those chairs, and if you know that the Dutch were favoring migration of furniture makers from the archipelago, but we can't attribute those to specific items, furniture items in the area. If lacquer is mentioned, sometimes different kind of timber is mentioned, then you have at least evidence. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, remains for me to thank you very much indeed.